Okay, so yes, this quarter we're going to be covering 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. You got those? Sometimes in books you will hear them referred to as the pastoral epistles. That comes from a misunderstanding in the religious world of what a pastor is. These men are not pastors, they are evangelists, so you will hear me refer to it as the evangelistic epistles because I got to be a rebel. The evangelist epistles are written by Paul to these two men, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. We'll actually cover it by looking at 1 Timothy, then we'll go to Titus, and then we'll go to 2 Timothy because that's in chronological order as opposed to looking at the two letters he wrote to Timothy and then the letter to Titus. 1 Timothy and Titus have a lot more in common than 1st and 2nd Timothy do. But as we look at Timothy, let's just start with a fun little thought exercise. If you had to describe Timothy in one word, what word would you pick? Young? Okay. Any others? Faithful. Young, faithful. That's all we know about him. Diligent. Okay. What? Son. Yeah, he was a son. And Paul felt like he was his son, too, on top of that. Yeah. So, anything else? Yep. Godly mother, had a godly grandmother. Those are more than one word, but I'll let it slide. Yeah, I don't know how you'd say that in one word. But yes, absolutely. Yes. Evangelist, yes. What? Somebody said something. Oh yeah, Paul's protege. He's an apprentice, right? Paul's his mentor. Absolutely. Okay, so as we look at Timothy, all of those things are going to apply, and so we want to spend kind of a moment looking at who he is to give us the context of this letter. Because imagine all of a sudden you were going through some old boxes and you came across some letters that were written, and the first thing you'd try and figure out is who wrote it and who they write it to. Right? And that would give you a lot of context to everything that you read. And so, in the case of Timothy, we'll spend more time talking about Timothy himself than we will about Paul, because I think Paul's probably the more well-known figure. But if you look at Acts 16, Paul comes to the territory of Derbe and Lystra, and behold, certain disciples there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. So we're introduced to him as being this person that Paul had probably run across in his first missionary journey with Barnabas, because he had traveled through Derbe and Lystra. But then as he goes through a second time, Derbe and Lystra, he runs into this guy named Timothy. And one of the dominant things that we find out at first is mom believes, father is a Greek. Now, when it says father is a Greek, but mom believes, what's kind of implied there about the father? Yeah, he's not a believer, right? That's the implication, and I think it's a fair assessment considering mom and grandma are mentioned and their faith, but it's never his dad's faith. And on top of it, Paul's going to have to circumcise Timothy to go on the journey. If his father was a Greek that had converted, he would have had his son circumcised. 2 Timothy 1:5, in that second letter, he'll mention his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice and their genuine faith. That's going to be a factor that we want to talk about pretty consistently in especially 1 Timothy, is this idea of genuine or sincere faith. Paul will make a big statement about that idea of sincerity of faith. And Acts 16 also says he's well spoken of by the brethren who are at Lystra and in Iconium. So Paul will eventually take him with him from this corner of the world of kind of the edges there of Asia Minor, and or that's more of kind of the beginning of the Galatian region. And so here he is. He's from this area of Lystra and Derbe. Now, For those of you who remember when we went through Acts, what happened to Paul when he was in Lystra and Derbe the first time with Barnabas? It's a pretty big deal that happened to him. He was stoned. That's right, he was stoned and drug out of the city and left for dead. So they drag him out of the city, believing him to be dead. Now, we don't know. He will stand back up. He'll actually go back into the city, which is not what I would have done if I had been stoned in that city. But we don't know if he's miraculously healed or if Paul is just, it's one of those things where he limps his way back in. But however it is, his relationship with those cities was a pretty clear one of persecution. And so here is Paul. First time he comes preaching through, he preaches Jesus Christ. One of the things they try and do is worship him. The Greek, the priest for Zeus tries to get everybody to worship Paul and Barnabas as gods. They make it clear we're not gods, and then eventually Paul gets stoned. Timothy would have either witnessed all of that or at the very least been very aware of those facts. So, I want you to keep that in mind when Paul says, I'd like to take Timothy with me. Timothy knows what he's getting into, right? This is not an easy life he's signing up for. This is not one with a pension plan and a 401k and good medical attention. This is a hard life of suffering and persecution for the cause of Christ. So when Timothy begins this, and begins to become a traveling companion to Paul, he's already a very zealous and passionate person for the Lord. 1 Corinthians 4, for this cause I've sent unto you Timothy, who is my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, who shall put you in remembrance of my ways which are in Christ, even as I teach everywhere in every church. When Paul had problems with the church at Corinth, he sent a couple of different guys, and the one that he said, I'm sending him, and I really want you to treat him well, and I really trust him, and he's beloved to me, and he's faithful, so listen to him, is Timothy. He said, look, when Timothy gets there, please listen to him. Please treat him with honor and respect, because he's going to teach you the things that I teach everywhere in every church. So that relationship of apprentice and mentor worked. Timothy would often be left behind places. When Paul was driven out, Timothy would stay behind and preach in places where Paul was driven out of. Thessalonica is a good example of that. When Paul was driven out of Thessalonica, it's Timothy who stays behind there to do that preaching. In 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul will mention, I sent Timothy, our brother and God's minister in the gospel of Christ, to establish you. So there's another word, minister, right? So as you look at him, he's a guy who early in life committed himself to following the Lord and making whatever sacrifices were required to do that. When Paul, because he'd been spoken well of, said, I'd like to take this guy with me, he said, I'm willing to go and face all of the hardships involved with that, including what's the first medical hardship that he's going to have to face if he's going to travel with Paul? He's going to be circumcised as an adult. I don't know any men signing up for that, right? But he did, and on top of it, what was Paul's teaching on circumcision? Is it necessary or not? It is not necessary. It was not necessary. You were 50% of the way there. You had a 50-50 shot. It's okay. It was not a requirement, right? The entire New Testament says, look, if you're a Gentile and you want to be a Christian, you don't need to be circumcised. It was required under the old law, but not under the new law. So Timothy is circumcised, not because it's necessary, but because it's a useful thing for him to go into the synagogues. So here's this conversation that Paul has with Timothy. Timothy, I'd like you to be circumcised because everybody knows, all the Jews know that your dad is a Greek. You don't do it to be saved. You're already a Christian. You're perfectly fine and right in the sight of God. But I think it might help us be a little bit more evangelistic, because some of these people are going to ask, and I can say, well, he's been circumcised, and then it makes it a non-issue so we can just get on to preaching Jesus. You want to have the surgery? Here's a knife. You see? This is not, I have to do it to be saved. This is, I just am doing it to preach the gospel. And that's the first thing to happen. After that, it's just one thing after another that guy will go through. So much so that in Hebrews 13, the Hebrew writer will say, know that our brother Timothy has been set at liberty. If Timothy has been set at liberty, where was he before? Not at liberty, right? He's imprisoned. So here is a guy that we think of Paul being beaten and stoned and thrown in prison, but Timothy followed suit. Timothy had his own journey of being a minister for the Lord, of being evangelistic, of going into these cities where some people loved the gospel and other people hated it. This is a guy who's made of sterner stuff. And one of the things that was mentioned is, here is Timothy, and he's a young man. Now, that is true. He is a young man, and Paul will refer to him as a young man. Anybody want to guess at what age he probably is being referred to as a young man? That is a good guess, but you are wrong. You are wrong too. Yeah, early 30s is a better guess. Because by the time Paul writes 1 Timothy, which is where he's referred to and told, let no man despise your youth, there's been time. Now, when he started, he probably was more like maybe 15, probably more like 19 when he started. But by the time you get to 1 Timothy, you're actually looking at a guy in his 30s, and he's being told, let no man despise your youth, because age is relative, right? If a guy in his 30s says, you know, when I was younger, what do all the guys in their 50s do? They laugh, they roll their eyes, right? Now, is he wrong when he says that, when I was younger? No, he once was younger and dumber than what he currently is. I mean, that's the problem. Like, I'm in my 40s now, and yes, I can tell you I used to be dumber than what I currently am. But the guys in their 50s and 60s are going, "Ah, that's funny, Scott. You're still pretty dumb." Right? It's all relative. So Timothy will continue to be this young man who served with Paul for a lengthy amount of time. And the other thing I want you to realize is when we talk about an apprentice, or a Paul-Timothy kind of mentor, journeyman apprentice sort of relationship, I don't want you to have in your mind that Paul held his hand every second. That is also an incorrect assessment. Because as you look at Paul would be driven out of a city, and then he would oftentimes leave Timothy behind for months at a time to preach on his own until he settled things down and then had a chance to catch up with Paul. That was a common occurrence, and Paul had a lot of confidence in Timothy. One of the things that I do think that we can sometimes fail to do is we can make the mistake of saying, until you're X age, you really aren't good for anything. I've gone to congregations, and it's like, well, you're not going to serve on the table, you're not going to serve in any sort of teaching capacity until you're like in your 50s. And so you have young people who are sitting in the pews, and they want to serve the Lord, and they think, I can start serving the Lord when I'm 50. Well, how well is that going to work? Yeah, by the time they're 50, what's happened? All that zeal and passion and fire. It's just toast, right? So Timothy starts out as a young man, probably in his teens, and Paul is using him. As he's growing, he's using him. Timothy, along that way, will make mistakes, I have no doubt. Paul will have to tell him, look, God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. Why do you think he has to tell him God hasn't given us a spirit of timidity? Because he'd be timid sometimes, right? All of those things are part of the life of Timothy, and so we want to keep some of those things in mind. But he will say in Philippians 2, I have no man like-minded who will truly care for your state. That is quite the statement. Of all, if Paul had favorites as far as congregations go, I don't know whether he did, but if he did, it would be Philippi. because he always had a good relationship with them from the very beginning. And so when he says to them, I have no man like-minded, and he refers to Timothy, that is about as high a compliment as you could possibly imagine. Think of the people that Paul was surrounded by, right? Timothy, Titus, Silas, Luke, all of these different people who he was surrounded by that we look at as true lions of faith. And yet he goes, of Timothy, he's the most like me. He is like-minded with me. As we begin to look at 1 Timothy, 1 Timothy 3, verse 15, I think is a good kind of thesis statement for what the letter is about. We will sometimes refer to it as a book, but I think it's important to remember it's a letter. It's a letter from a mentor to an apprentice. It's a letter from the aged evangelist to the younger evangelist. And in there he says, if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. 1 Timothy could be summed up by this verse. Everything that we're going to read in 1 Timothy is going to be either about how Timothy as an individual should behave within the local church, or how any other individual, whether male or female, young or old, should conduct themselves within the local congregation. And also reminding us what is the job of a local congregation, to be the pillar and the ground of the truth. The way that I best understand that, and it helps me to visualize it, is a pillar is like a column, right? So you imagine these giant Greek columns that they would have seen in all the different cities that they went to, right? Massive Parthenon-like columns. And on each of those columns, there's also there's a capital at the top, which is that kind of filigreed thing that comes out and flattens up, and then there is a ground at the bottom. The column the pillar is what holds the structure up, keeps the roof up, and the ground keeps it from wobbling, right? The job of the church is to hold the truth up and hold it steady. If you are holding it steady but you're not holding it up, the church isn't doing its job. If we're holding it up but we're not holding it steady, the church isn't doing its job. It's got to be both of those things. So everything in this letter is going to be associated with that idea of what does it mean for me as a Christian to behave within the local congregation in a way that I am helping that work to be done, to hold the truth up and to hold it steady. Anybody have any comments or questions or anything like that before we keep moving? Okay, so 1 Timothy's purpose, we can kind of break this down a couple of things. First, let's start off with the dating. It's written somewhere between 66 or 67 AD as Paul was passing through Macedonia. If you remember, after Paul is imprisoned, he will, at the end of the book of Acts, he's going to be let out. And it's during that time period that 1 Timothy is written. So after his initial Roman imprisonment. It's one of only 3 individuals we have record of Paul writing to, right? He writes to Timothy, he writes to Titus, and he writes to one other person. Philemon, that's right. So Timothy, Titus, and Philemon are the only individual letters that we ever get from Paul, which makes them unique and interesting because most of the time it's a little bit more like a sermon, right? When Paul writes to the church at Philippi, he's writing to a whole group of people, and it's a little bit like if he were to stand up and give a sermon at Eastland, which would be the best sermon you ever heard, right? If you could hear Paul preach. But it would be somewhat generic because we all come from different walks of life. We're all at different stages of life. We all have different tendencies, strengths, weaknesses. So when you talk to a large group of people, you have to, by definition, leave it a little bit generic, right? But when you're talking to an individual, then the intimate details come out. The more specific conversations happen, right? It's the difference between a sermon and 2 people sitting an easy chair is next to a coffee table having a conversation. There's a huge difference in the nature of the conversation. So 1 Timothy will be that way. Along that line, there's going to be two major topics that they're going to deal with. One, they're going to deal with preachers. When two preachers get together, an old preacher and a young preacher get together and they start talking, guess what they talk about? Other preachers. That's what we do. We talk about preaching life. And one of the reasons you talk about preaching life when you're with another preacher is because they're the only ones who get it. You think about Paul and all the things that he's been through. Do you really appreciate what Paul has been through? If you say yes, you're wrong. You've not lived his life. The long days and walking into town and not knowing what this city will be like and where do I preach first, and then all of a sudden the Lord opens the door of opportunity, or maybe that door of opportunity looks like a jail cell. And all of those things that he went through, the beatings, the uncertainty, here I've been at this congregation 3 weeks and then I left and I had to hope that they would remain faithful to the Lord after only 3 weeks worth of teaching. Look, if you started a congregation and you were only able to be there 3 weeks and then you had to leave, what do you think the chances are they would remain faithful years and years later? But that's Thessalonica. That's the church in Thessalonica, is exactly that. Paul was there, Timothy was there. They've been through these things. They know what it's like when all of a sudden there's persecution from the Jews or there's persecution from the governing authorities. So they're going to talk about those things, and they're going to talk about, Paul will also talk to them about, look, what does it really mean to do your job? What's the job? Interestingly, when we want to see the qualifications for elders, we go to two books. We go to 1 Timothy, and what's the other one? We go to Titus. That's where we go to for the qualifications for elders. I was teaching this book one time, and I said what I'm about to say now, and I had somebody come up to me afterwards. They go, wait a second, you mean to tell me that preachers have qualifications too? Yeah, they do. Absolutely they do. Guess where you're going to find those? 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. That's where you're going to find what it means to be a preacher. So here is your chance to just look and dissect whether I'm doing my job. But truly, that's a lot of what they're going to talk about is what's the job? What's preaching? It's a weird profession, just to be up front with you. It's kind of an odd deal. Do you know what I do all day? I either talk or I think about talking. That's weird. And then you all go, oh, keep it up. Okay, I'll just keep talking and thinking about talking. But that's the life of preaching. And it's a weird life. And so if you ever get a chance to be in the same room with 2 or 3 older, like the old preachers, the guys who've been through it, and you could just listen. Don't add your thoughts. Just sit there quietly. You will hear crazy stuff because they've just lived a weird life. And so Paul will talk to Timothy about that. The second will be just the general work of the local church, because that's where preachers work, right? There's a certain job, and of all the people you're going to deal with, it's going to be the people in a local congregation. So you've got to help them. So he'll talk about qualifications for elders and deacons. He'll talk about caring for the needy. He'll talk about worship. He'll talk about men and women in the church and both their roles and their necessity. If you don't recognize that men and women are different, you're going to have a hard time being a decent preacher. If you don't recognize that worship, there's a way that God wants it done. And I'm not just saying, and I put the word just in there so you understand what I'm saying. I'm not just saying the order and the specifics of doctrine like instrumental music, or more specifically non-instrumental music. I'm not just saying that. Does God care about the how we do it? Yeah. Does He care about the why? Does He care about the demeanor and the character you have in doing it? All of those things. He's going to talk about all of that stuff. And so the two major topics are he's going to either be talking about preacher stuff, and we get to be a fly on the wall between two of the greatest evangelists the world has ever seen. Yes. That's my fault, not yours. Don't worry about it. That means I haven't clarified it. Let me clarify it. Yep. Hmm. Oh, yeah, he will. In fact, he'll even mention that in this letter. He'll even talk about in this letter how he is unworthy to be called an apostle because of all the different things that he did, that it was only through the grace of God he got to preach in the first place. So, yeah, he very much remembered the life he had before where he persecuted Christians, and his conversion. One of the things that I think led Paul to be the kind of evangelist he was he realized how much he needed the grace of God because he had done more to hurt the church in his early life than anybody else. So, does that help? Okay. Now, are you thinking of Peter? Keep saying denied. Peter was the one who denied him 3 times and was an apostle beforehand. Paul was the one killing Christians. Yes. Now you got it. You've exactly got it right. So he had a vision on the road to Damascus. Jesus spoke to him and said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So yes, I just want to make sure you weren't confusing Paul and Peter, which of course is easy to do because they both start with P. Yep. Yeah. The dude was Jesus, if that helps. Yeah. So as we look at 1 Timothy, that's kind of the major pattern that we're going to see there. I left it off the chart there until the very end, but also we'll talk about how to treat older and younger. That will be another factor there. So as you begin 1 Timothy and you get into chapter 1, there's going to be several different phrases and patterns that show up multiple times. Now, this is a good practice, by the way, if you're about to study a book or a section of the Bible for the first time, is just look for patterns or phrases. Now, it used to be super hard to do this. When I first started preaching, if I wanted to find a phrase or a pattern, I either had to have a commentary that just told me, and I was like, oh, well, somebody else already counted it up, or I'd have to look through the whole book and go, hey, I think I've seen that one before, and then I have to go back and double check every one. You know what you can do now? ChatGPT. I'm going to let you use technology, and I'm just going to be honest with you that you can do this. You can go and you say, are there any phrases or patterns that are repeated in 1 Timothy? And they will help you. It's artificial intelligence, so it's not perfect, but it'll save you a little bit of time. If you're going to go and read a book for the first time, that's a great use of AI, is to just say, I'm going to read this section of the Bible. I'm going to be reading Hebrews. Are there any phrases or patterns that are consistent through the book? And it'll give you a list. Now, does that teach you the book of Hebrews? Does not. It does not in any way. So don't think you can chat GPT your way through your faith. But you can do that. Oh, when does it say? 62 to 60. Yeah, so a lot of that's based off of particular kings at different times, and there's 2 different philosophies, and ChatGPT is wrong. So that's all that is. Yes, it is. Yeah, and that is tied to different Caesars and things like that. Yeah, so it is. It's based off of that. So yes, that is one of the dating options. I just happen to disagree, although it's like right in there, right? So I'm going to put it at 66, 67. You can back it up to maybe like 62, 63. And, I mean, how much does it change things? Nothing, other than that ChatGPT is wrong. Humans still win. So one of those patterns and phrases is God our Savior. Now, referencing God shouldn't surprise you. You can see that throughout the Bible. But it is multiple times and almost exclusively in this letter that you will see this phrase, God our Savior. So that you know that Paul is attempting to emphasize something to Timothy in his letter that has to do with salvation. And what you're going to find is that as he's talking to him about the work of the church and he's talking about the work of being a preacher, what is on his mind every step of the way is we preach Jesus because Jesus saves people. We go through all this hard work. Timothy, you're going to go through all sorts of different things, and you're going to have bad days, and it's going to be hard, and you're going to wonder why you're doing this sometimes. But remember, the reason you do this is because we have God, our Savior. So that pattern of remembering your salvation, remembering your hope, remembering what this is all about, why do we do the things we do as Christians, that's going to be tied in there. Another is the term of faithful saying. This not only shows up in 1 Timothy, but it shows up in all of the evangelist epistles. And some of your translations will translate it a trustworthy saying, which is really the same thing, right? If it's a faithful saying, it is a trustworthy saying. And the emphasis here is Paul is teaching them some doctrine. Here are things that are true. You can take it to the bank. It is accurate and it will always hold. In a world where people are fickle and politics change and people's attitudes towards things are like the waves of the sea tossed here and there, I have a faithful saying. And so he's emphasizing this idea of we have truth, which if you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, which I said is kind of the core idea behind 1 Timothy, what's the job of the church with things that are true? Hold them up, hold them steady. So when he says it's a faithful saying, it's a trustworthy saying, it's a true saying, that's the emphasis. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. No, I agree with that. It's like, get the idea across. What they do with it is going to be on them. But you get the idea across, you preach it. This is the faithful saying. Yeah, and so that is tied to that. Which brings us to the third one that shows up multiple times here, which is the faith. Now, there's a difference between faith and the faith. Every one of us has faith. But that faith is a growing or diminishing thing. It is an ever-changing thing. Your personal faith. That's why Peter can say things like, increase my faith. Right? The apostles understood sometimes that what God told them to do would require them to be more faithful than what they currently were. Your faith is an ever-changing thing. Hopefully, you have more faith now than you did 5 years ago. But I imagine if we're honest with ourselves that there are even seasons in our life where our faith has been growing and then you go through a season of diminishing faith for a bit. And you've got to correct, and hopefully it's going like this, right? We're always on the way up in the long term. But individual faith is a somewhat mercurial thing. But the faith is static. It is consistent. And that's what you preach. He says, preach the faith. The faith is the teaching of Jesus Christ. It is the way, the truth, and the life. It is a thing that is unchanging, and there is always a right answer. In my life and my faith, there are some days where I'm more faithful and some days where I'm less faithful. Is the faith ever less faithful? It's always the same, right? It's from God. It's consistent. It doesn't change. You have anything? Yep, it is. That's exactly right. It is an unchanging pattern for how God wishes for His people to live. Now, me trying to match my life up into that pattern, that's a lot of course correction, right? It's like if you have a ship and they're trying to dock with the International Space Station, right? You're going to have to make a lot of individual adjustments to dock. But the pattern itself is static. It is consistent. And so he is pointing to this idea of a God who saves us and tells us faithful things and gives us a faithful pattern, the faith, to hold to. Okay, anybody have any comments or questions before we move from there? Okay. If you look, there's going to be a zillion different potential questions that come up. In fact, I'm going to save myself my time by making the animation move faster. Things like, how should young Christians treat older Christians? Now, that's a practical, everyday question. It's a real-life question that Paul will address. And I want you to imagine for a second if it wasn't ever addressed. If it was how older Christians should treat younger Christians and how younger Christians should treat older Christians, what would naturally happen when you have an age gap between people? If we just left people to their own devices and God gave us no instructions, what happens between young people and old people? There's a division. Yeah. Because the old ones are boomers. Right? That's right. No, I joke about it, but like we have phrases like this. You got boomers and precious snowflakes. This is what we do. We separate, right? The older ones go, you have not seen what I've been through, you don't know nothing. And the younger ones go, you can't even check your email. And so there's this world of divide. One of the most beautiful things about the church is how God bridges that divide. A congregation that has unity and has synthesized the young and the old is a vibrant congregation. The older ones provide wisdom, stability, experience. The younger ones provide life and energy, right? I mean, the joke is, when that class lets out, those halls are going to look like an elementary school. I mean, that's what we got right now. That is a wonderful blessing, right? How about we let the 5-year-old preach? Let's just change the elders out. We don't need elders, those old guys. Let's get rid of them, and let's have the second graders make all the decisions. What would happen? We all know what would happen, right? You've got to put those things together, those ages together in a way that's beautiful, where it emphasizes the strengths and gives each one a chance to grow. Older people have a wisdom and an experience that younger people don't have, but they also tend to have a less energy, and they also tend towards things like bitterness. Because life has kicked you in the teeth enough that you become jaded. And then young people show up, and they don't have any of that wisdom, and they're bright-eyed, and the whole world is in front of them, and they help you to see the world through their eyes and to enjoy it and to remember the beauty of the faith that we have. Yeah. It is. It really is. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, that relationship between Paul and Timothy is exactly that, an older man and a younger man, and the love between the two. And one of the things that Paul will emphasize, more so in 2 Timothy than in 1 Timothy, is that he knows he's going to die, and it's all going to be okay. Because he gets to go on to his reward, and the work will be left to men like Timothy. When the older and the younger are brought together, you can have confidence and know that the Lord's work will continue, and there's good things, and that wisdom can get passed down. So it's just a really beautiful thing. And that's just one of many kind of practical things that come up in 1 Timothy. Okay. I'm going to shoot through this very quickly, but if you remember when we last covered Acts, I have this section I call Acts 29. Acts 29, if you are familiar with Acts, is not there. It is my addition to the Scriptures. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but Paul, at the end of the book of Acts, he's in Roman imprisonment awaiting trial. We have ample evidence from the letters that he writes that he eventually gets out from this first Roman imprisonment and will travel some more. So if you gather those details together, you get a little bit of a journey of him traveling to all these different places. Now, I have a bunch of different verses for each of those places, with him eventually ending back in Rome again. But what I want you to see is, during that journey, there will come a point as Paul is headed to Macedonia where he leaves Timothy in Ephesus. That is where Timothy is when this letter is written. So in verse 3 of 1 Timothy chapter 1, he says, "As I urged you, upon my departure for Macedonia, remain on at Ephesus." So all of this is Timothy in Ephesus trying to help the congregation there. Now, if you look at the history of Ephesus, Ephesus is a very strong, vibrant congregation. It grew very quickly during Paul's initial time there. He actually spent about 2 to 3 years there in Ephesus, and the group grew and grew and grew. But it's also the same group of people that Paul, when he is in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 20, he gathers the Ephesian elders, and what does he tell the Ephesian elders is going to happen in Ephesus? Anybody remember? He warns them that you're going to have to watch out because there's going to be wolves that come in even from your own number. So they're a growing, successful congregation that also has some internal problems that are going to need to be dealt with. Enter Timothy. Timothy's going to stay in Ephesus, go through that process of helping them to be strong and faithful as long as possible. And something to consider here is, when they started in Ephesus, they were very successful, right? By the time you get to Acts 20, Paul is saying, hey, you got to watch out, bad things can happen. By the time you get to the book of Revelation and Jesus gives them a report card, what does he say they've done? The church in Ephesus says, what? They've lost their first love. So Ephesus, over time, will eventually be a congregation that Jesus says, I am no longer going to recognize you as my people if you keep this up. You've left your first love. So, does that mean Paul was unsuccessful? Does it mean Timothy is unsuccessful? No, you just preach the word, and you preach the word in season and out of season. And that's part of what he'll deal with Timothy. It's like, look, you just do your job, and then people will make the choices they make. And so that's another aspect to the whole thing. Okay, we'll close down there. We'll close down there, and starting next week, I will actually be out of town, but Jake will be teaching here for me next week, and he'll get into the actual text. So thank you so much, and class dismissed.